All right. Hello, folks. My name is Isaac Meyer. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based out of Seattle, Washington. And for the past 8 years, 9 years, oh my God, I have been working on the History of Japan podcast in my spare time. In the last couple of years, I've been working on a separate history podcast, Criminal Records, with my partner. But as I was starting History of Japan, I was also in the midst of an academic career, which ended in 2016 when I decided to leave my PhD program at the University of Washington in modern history without finishing it. So today I'm going to talk to you about my experience with academia and why I ended up leaving it. In particular, on my glorious bullet point outline, I have 4 main points. Why did I get into academia? How was it when I was there? Why did I leave? And where am I now? And some kind of final thoughts for aspiring people in academics. And the reason I decided I wanted to do this was because in addition to questions about the podcast, I get asked a lot about, because I talk about it on both podcasts, my experience with the academy and with academics, advice I have for people. And so it feels a little self-indulgent to talk so much about my own experience. But I hope it's helpful for anyone who is adjacent to the academic life, just to hear a little bit about it. So with that in mind, let's get this show on the road. So why I got into academia was because, frankly, I loved history from a very, very young age. I was infamous in my K through 12 education for doing things like reading history textbooks for fun. I would read through the entire social studies textbook in the first couple weeks of the school year because I was just that curious to know more. And in high school, I was already trying to convince my parents to take me to academic bookstores and buy me bound volumes of academic texts. I unfortunately can't get it for you because my library of books is currently in a room that is locked off as I have some contractors working on my house. But I still have the copy of the 900-page Making of Modern Japan by Marius Jansen that I convinced my parents to buy me when I was 16 as a birthday present. Because I was that curious to read the book. And that's normally the kind of thing you would read in graduate school. So that's just to give you some sense of where I was at. And then I got into college. I started doing some really cool research on modern Japanese history, specifically on the history of kendo, of Japanese fencing, after the start of Japan's modernization. And it was really fun and interesting. And I got to, spend all of my time diving into something that I was really curious about. Fundamentally, I just really enjoyed talking about history with other smart people who liked talking about history. And so I can't even remember in college seriously questioning the idea that I wouldn't try for a PhD program at some point, or at least a master's program. I honestly can't think of a time when that was ever seriously in doubt for me. And so I immediately, in my senior year of college, signed up for the GRE, did all the applications, all that fun stuff, and got into the University of Washington in Seattle, into the master's program in Japanese studies, and crucially got it with a scholarship, which some of the other places I got into did not offer. And so I ended up out here. And my experience with academia was honestly pretty all over the place. If you've gone to college in the U.S., generally that tends to be more of a kind of departmentally focused or even like institutionally focused experience. It's more about the department you're working with, the institution you're working with, the degree programs, how those are viewed. Graduate programs are very one-on-one. They are very kind of driven by your individual relationships with the people you end up working with. I would always liken it to a sort of medieval style apprenticeship where you apprentice yourself to a small group of people who will teach you the trade, and then you kind of take that out into the world. And the individual nature of those relationships meant, frankly, that my experience was extremely variable in terms of quality. Some professors took the role of being a mentor in academia extremely seriously. Others really did not. One of the things I just want to say is that this is not going to be like a dunk session where I'm like naming and shaming people. Like, this person didn't treat me right. And that's not really the point of this. Again, the idea here really is to just, peel back kind of the mystery of what this is, what my experience was at least. But I did have some people who were really incredible, and just to give, to name them because they do deserve it at UW. Raymond Jonas in the Modern European History Department, and Sadia Pekkanen and Marie Antrodogi in the Japan Studies program at UW. They kind of took that mentorship role very seriously, but that really was kind of the exception and not necessarily the rule. And one of the kind of links, I think, between those three people, all of whom I still really think very highly of to this day, is that they took the idea that academia was not just for academics, but that we were kind of doing work that was valuable for everyone, and that part of that work was to kind of make research accessible to non-academics. That was something that all three of those people really express in their career to this day. And I think that's part of why I clicked with those three people so strongly, because I feel very much the same. And devoted a lot of my time to the History of Japan podcast because I loved the work and I loved, producing things that made history accessible. But that's not really incentivized in academia. You're evaluated primarily on your publication output, and the sort of communication side of it, trying to present the face of academia to the outside world, is not something traditionally that you're really evaluated on, particularly early on in a career. And squaring that circle for me proved really challenging, because the part I loved the most was the kind of presenting and talking to people. I loved teaching. The first couple classes I taught, I was like, this is what I'm here for. The chance to kind of take these ideas and communicate them to students and see that kind of that light bulb moment when it clicks. Loved it, still love it. But again, that's not really what the system incentivizes. And I, in particular, had a lot of trouble with that because I worked with a professor who was pretty late in his career, and took an extremely hands-off approach to mentoring, was very focused on the traditional kind of publish-or-perish side of things. Which, if you haven't heard that phrase before, it's the idea essentially that academics always need to be focused on publication output to further their careers, and that anything else is kind of a waste of time. My mother-in-law, who passed a few years ago, used to tell me a story about her experience. She was also an academic, where the university she worked at, the undergraduate teaching award was, which you're voted on by the undergrad students, who was the best teacher for undergrads this year. The professors called it the kiss of death, because if you got the undergraduate teaching award, it meant that you were not focusing enough on your research, and were spending too much time working with the undergraduates. So that gives you a kind of sense of what that system can be like if you are not very into the kind of research side of things. And the lead professor I worked with, my supervisor in the PhD program, was very much of that mold and of that opinion. Also, being kind of further up in years, was not very in touch with the modern job market. So kind of discussing career prospects with him was a real challenge, particularly because these days, if you go into academia, you can expect to be making, relative to the work you're doing, way below minimum wage. My yearly stipend from UW in terms of pay was something like $17,000 a year. It was extremely low. And even with supplementing that, when I started having a Patreon for the podcast, when I started eventually teaching community college, I did not make very much money at all. But trying to have conversations with him about like how can I afford housing in a very competitive city like Seattle. I still remember taking his advice not to buy anything in Seattle after the housing crash because I could have afforded it at that point. But he was like, you might be leaving for dissertation research and you don't know if you'll be back. You're doing like a postgraduate program somewhere else. And so it's not worth it. And I listened to him and I still regret that decision. But I think one of the biggest turning points for me in terms of realizing how much this just was not clicking for me was actually my first research trip to Japan as a graduate student, working directly with archives. In that case, it was the Kokuritsu Kokai Toshokan, the National Diet Library, which is the equivalent of the Library of Congress in the U.S. And in the summer of 2013, I think, something like that, or 14, around there, I got funding to go to Tokyo to start some research for what was kind of looking like it would be my dissertation at that point on the culture and politics of the Japanese army during the Second World War. And I had not really done that kind of serious archival research before. You do some limited stuff like that in an undergraduate program where you're working directly with untranslated primary sources, finding them yourself in an archive and trying to make sense of them as a historian. But graduate school is really the first time when you're expected to do that in a more serious way. And I didn't get a lot of prep, so I went to the archive, had to kind of try and figure out the terminal system, because the way it works with those sources is that you can only get scanned copies of them. You can't actually handle the original documents because they're so old and beat up. I started trying to put together what I could of the sources, and I realized I was having a hell of a time actually finding anything. And what I could find was all handwritten. And if you're familiar with cursive Japanese, it's very, very hard to read unless you have specialist training in how to do it, which I did not. And I hadn't been warned about the weird terminal system the Diet Library uses, where certain sources are only searchable in certain places. Very strange. I was having a hard time with the language. And to be honest, I had a panic attack. I went and hid in a bathroom for 2 hours and just kind of freaked out for a bit. And that moment, particularly in retrospect, when I started kind of getting further along in the program, was really when I think it started to click for me. Like, I don't know that this is for me. I don't know that this is what I want to do. But I wasn't really getting... I didn't really have someone I felt like I could talk with about that feeling or that sense of kind of increasing alienation from my own work. Eventually, I ended up making the decision to leave in 2016. A big part of that was financial. If my memory serves, there was a government shutdown that year. Who can remember at this point? It happens so often in the U.S. But it seriously threatened the funding for my PhD department to the point where many of us didn't know if we would have stipends the next year. Public universities in the US, like UW, constantly have financial issues. And to be fair, particularly for departments like history, where I was working, we're not always great about making a message clear to the public about why what we do matters, and why it's viable and important to fund. And so we had chronic funding shortages, and I had a hard time with the stress of not knowing if I would have an income in the next academic year. My experience, that first archival experience, did get better. I started to kind of learn how to futz my way through the experience of working with Japanese archives, but I really didn't enjoy it. It was incredibly stressful, particularly because I wasn't getting a lot of good guidance about how to approach archives, who useful contacts would be in terms of narrowing down my research and finding assistance while I was in Japan. Whereas teaching was something I really enjoyed so much more. I also had increasingly difficult relationships with people on my PhD committee. You work so closely with them. It really is like an apprenticeship in a lot of ways, where you are kind of learning directly from one person and not from the whole department. And if that relationship goes sour, it is difficult to continue onward. And all of it was just incredibly emotionally stressful. It was draining. It was pretty overwhelming. And I just couldn't deal with it after a certain point. I didn't want to keep doing it. The other thing I really want to note is that one of the biggest stresses was actually on my relationship with my now wife, then partner, because the academic program I was in was frankly extremely sexist. There was a lot of assumptions that female partners of male students, and it was an overwhelmingly male department, would financially support us. They were the ones who would make up our incredibly small stipends, but also that their careers would be kind of tailored to our academic needs, where if I needed to go do dissertation research abroad for a year, they would help fund the cost of me doing that, and paying their rent in Seattle and helping to pay my rent in Japan. And if I needed to move for a postdoctorate program after I graduated, they would be willing to move with me, or we'd be willing to commit to a long distance relationship. And just those assumptions that essentially my wife's career, which she is very proud of and has worked extremely hard on, existed to serve my academic pursuits, it was damaging to our relationship. And I ultimately value that relationship more than almost any other relationship I have. That's why we ended up getting married. And so eventually all of this kind of led me to a place where I was looking at alternatives to academia, which again was not something we'd gotten a lot of support with. We'd gotten a couple of professionalization classes, but they were mostly focused on how to apply for tenure track jobs. We got, I think, one day out of a 12-week semester on alternative career paths to academia. So I started doing research on my own. I found teaching at independent or private schools as an alternative. I started putting my name onto some applications. I got a job offer from a local private school. I guess it's not that hard to find. It's the Northwest School in Seattle, Washington. I took the job offer and I'm still there now. I teach high school for a living and never made it past the candidacy phase of my PhD. So I've completed all my coursework, but I never wrote a dissertation. And I love what I do now. Unfortunately, I'm still in the middle of moving, as those of you who listen to the podcast know. So normally my office is actually surrounded with thank you cards I've gotten from former students. You can kind of see I have some gifts over here from former students of mine. And I have a bunch more in my office at work. And it really, that switch has made me feel like I'm making much more of a difference and doing things that I find really valuable and meaningful. I love teaching, and I feel called to do it, which sounds kind of self-indulgent, but hey. I still care a lot about academia. I still try and stay on top of the latest research. Marshall Poe, who's the editor of the New Books Network, is here for the convention. And his network is fantastic for helping busy people like me stay on top of what's happening in the world of academia. So, plug for the New Books Network. It's awesome. But I am out and I have no plans to go back. So really quickly, as I'm getting on my 20-minute marker before moving over to the Q&A, I'm always asked for advice for aspiring academics about, if I'm thinking about going to graduate school, what should I do? The two things I always tell everyone: pick the people you work with carefully. You are not really going to a university. You are going to work with a small cadre of people who will be your PhD supervisors. And think carefully about who you want that to be, and don't just pay attention to the research. Pay attention to how they treat you, because that is equally, arguably more important than raw academic attainment. The second thing I would say is make sure you have a backup plan. Academic jobs are brutally competitive. I remember that the year I left UW, the AHA, the American Historical Organization or Association, excuse me, released a report saying something like 50% of tenure track gigs in history in the U.S. went to graduates of Ivy League programs plus like Stanford, and that graduates of every other PhD program in the U.S. were competing for the other 50% of jobs. I have not stayed on top of the academic job market. I would assume it's only gotten worse with the funding cuts of the last few years, with now the uncertainty surrounding COVID. Um, so make sure that you have something that you can do that is not academia that will make you happy after you've invested half a decade or more of your life in the world of academia. I still, again, feel that the academic world is a valuable one. I believe very strongly in the power of knowledge, but I think it's important that people go in with clear eyes. And so, I wanted to be very frank about my experience, and I think that's my time. And now it's question time, correct? Yeah, I think I think it's a real challenge. I mean, for me, the way that really manifested the most was language. Obviously, studying Japanese history, you have to know Japanese, but the academic programs you take are really tailored to reading research in Japanese. And to this day, I read the language fairly well, and I can speak decently on political subjects, but like I couldn't really talk about food at all or entertainment. I was never really spent time learning it because that was not what you were incentivized to do. The kind of stuff that is connected more to day life. I think it really kind of varied depending on the subject. One of the things I worked on a little bit while I was in my program was on political theory and international relations. And in that discipline, you end up working with a lot of people who have experience in the State Department, or there were a lot of ex-military people in that field, a lot of people with experience in international trade. And so in that discipline, there was this real sense of like connection to the outside world, and a sense of mission almost in terms of like having a wider sort of scene outside of academia that you were connected to. But in other parts of the discipline, it was often very hard to make sense, to remind yourself of the question of like, how does this matter to regular people, or why should it matter to regular people? It's very easy to answer that question for specialists, but I think a lot of academics aren't encouraged to ask that question, or are encouraged to treat it as kind of secondary to the question of specialist engagement. I think the biggest thing for me was that a lot of the politics of the system, the kind of individual one-on-one relationships that are a big part of academia, was kind of treated as invisible in a certain sense. It wasn't something you were really talked to about explicitly. You were just kind of expected to pick up on that. And I think having a clearer way of framing the importance of, this person is your advisor and this is what you should be expecting from them. And if you're not getting it, this is who you should talk to. Kind of a more systemic process in place, I think, would help alleviate some of that. And a lot of departments do have that. UW had a graduate program supervisor, but it was also, the history program was huge. I never met all the other graduate students in history because UW is so big. I hung out with the other, like the Asia studies people. It was the China, Korea, and Japan folks, and we hung out with some of like Southeast Asia and India folks. But I didn't know most of the American studies PhD students or the European or African history ones. And, the size of the department, I think, makes it very hard to stay on top of, for one person, of all of that politicking and all of that relational stuff and make sure it's clicking the way it's supposed to. But there does need to be some kind of systemic check in place to evaluate, I think, advisors and committee members to make sure they're serving the needs of the people that they're supposed to be kind of training. Where right now it's just very much up to, in my experience, the goodwill of the people doing the job. And some people do take that extra step. But others either need a kick in the pants or kind of don't see, treat it as very kind of sink or swim, which is not, in my mind, the way to go. Absolutely, it's not my area of expertise, and I will admit that I didn't pick up on this until my wife named it explicitly and kind of said, "Hey, have you noticed this?" And then when she mentioned it, I was like, "Oh shit!" Like, "Oh yeah." So I think just the naming of it, so that you can then see it when it's there, is kind of the most valuable step. And I think there's a lot of hesitancy to do that among graduate students because you don't want to be perceived as rocking the boat, particularly in chronically underfunded public programs where you are always kind of scrambling in the Hunger Games to make sure you have funding for the next calendar year. But some kind of mechanism of being able to name, hey, this dynamic is happening and we should talk about it, I think has to be the first step, at least. I have heard of happy science. So the hilarious thing about working in political history in Japan, you don't meet a lot of normal people, but the people you do meet are highly memorable. And in particular, I didn't run into a lot of happy science or other new religion movements in Japan. I mostly just ran into other Japanese graduate students who would all go to the cheap bars in Tokyo and drink away our sorrows after a day of research. But I would also run into a lot of, because my research was in the National Diet Library, which is right next to the Japanese parliament, a lot of protesters, and in particular members of what are called Uyoku Dantai, right-wing ultranationalist movements, who will their favorite thing is they get these trucks covered in militant slogans and Japanese flags, and they just blast World War II patriotic songs while driving around in circles. And I would see them almost every day, and it was really weird because some of them were like, hell is this white boy doing here? Watching us do this protest, and others would be waving to me hey, he's interested, let's say hi. And I would, very few of them ever came to talk to me, but they were, other than academics, they were the ones I would see the most of because I was always by the diet. And, especially whenever I was there during election years, you'd see a lot of those folks around. Also, occasionally communists, which was funny. They were they would set up their own kind of rallies and protests near the diet. It's good times. They would always be very excited to talk to me when I said I was doing research on the Imperial Japanese Army. I would never tell them what kind of research, or that it was all about Japanese war crimes. But I am very proud of, I assume, when I was doing the podcast and I did an episode on the Nanjing Massacre, I got a angry comment on my website, which I then deleted, from a self-proclaimed Uyoku Dantai member who called me a shill for the Chinese Communist Party, because I did not question the reality of the Nanjing Massacre. And right below it, I got a comment from a Chinese nationalist calling me a shill for the Japanese government, because I was talking about the kind of the politicization of the massacre in modern Chinese politics. So I'm pretty... Yeah, I put it up on my wall. I think that's the certificate of quality for the podcast right there. I would love to. I actually did no work to make that happen. I got an email out of the blue early in 2019 from a guy saying he was a producer and wanted me on this documentary, and I was like, okay, this is probably a scam. But I'll just plug his name into Google and it'll show that this guy doesn't exist. And then it pulled up his IMDb page, and I was like, oh, okay. So everything kind of went forward from there. I'm very hopeful because I know Age of Samurai did pretty good numbers on Netflix, that there will be more programming like that in the future, and that if there is, and that same company is working on it, they seemed to like me. They flew me out twice and recorded 10 hours of footage for me. So, I'm hoping that there will be more stuff like that. I don't think it's ever going to become, or even podcasting is ever going to become my primary vocation, because I love being in a classroom and I love working with kids directly. But it's a really fun thing to do on the side. And also all of my kids are now super impressed with me because I was on TV. And so if I can, keep building up the cred with the young people that way, absolutely. So in general, I'm always very in favor of cross-disciplinary programming. I teach in a cross-disciplinary department now, and I teach literature, which is not a thing I thought I would ever do. But I think I can bring a good and valuable context to it as a historian. And it's really useful to get out of your scholarly bubbles and to kind of confront the assumptions that are implicit in your field of study and how you're trained to approach a subject. I think one of the most valuable experiences I had in graduate school was working in the field of political science and IR theory, because the sort of basic assumption of history is diving into the complexity and the minutia and getting super into the fine details of everyday life, where those theory-driven courses are very zoomed out, and it's all about what generalizations can we make and justify without being so abstract that what we're deriving as principles is meaningless. And it was just a very different way of thinking about intellectual life that really challenged a lot of my assumptions and assumptions I was picking up from other historians about what it was we were trying to do as academics. And I'm very in favor of having your assumptions challenged, even if you don't end up changing them. The process of re-justifying them to yourself, I think, is very good for sharpening your own intellectual focus. So I think any program you can work with in an interdisciplinary setting, go for it. Anything that expands your horizons and gives you new connections. Great question. And I think the names I will always name for anything before 1600, so the kind of heyday of the samurai, the civil wars, all of that, look for anything that is written by either Mary Elizabeth Berry, not to be confused with Mary Berry, the cooking and baking expert, but Mary Elizabeth Berry, Professor Emeritus from, I want to say, UC Berkeley. She did a lot of great, very accessible historical work on the kind of high medieval period in Japan. And Carl Friday is the other one to look at. He is also a very well-regarded academic, but in my opinion, writes in a way that is not necessarily easy, but is not as kind of jargony and is very followable, even if you're not an academic. For anything kind of later in Japanese history, the kind of gold standard is always, in my opinion, Marius Jansen's The Making of Modern Japan, which is the book I got my parents to buy when I was 16. That's a graduate level reading. It's not dense or jargony, it's just very long. But if you're at all interested in Japanese history, it is still, I think, the most authoritative thing written on history after 1600 ever in terms of coverage in one book. So whatever you are curious about, odds are good it is in there somewhere. And then from there, if you have specialist things you want to know more about, anyone is always welcome to email me or contact me on Facebook. I don't really use Twitter anymore because Twitter is a hateful cesspit of a place. But I am happy to talk book recommendations anytime. So if you've got specific stuff you want to know about, just reach out. Oh my God, it's rough, man. It's real rough. Academia trains some very good habits of mind, but organization in terms of time and responding consistently to messages and all that is not necessarily one of them. And I did find that especially older professors who were extremely established and had, tenure that meant they would be there until the heat death of the universe, they were not great about. I recall having to camp outside of a professor's office for 4 hours at a stretch to get a hold of this person who was on my PhD committee. So it's not just you. No, that's I think a universal phenomenon. I can't actually think of any off the top of my head, and I've been out of the game for a little while, and I know that the at least from what I've seen kind of from the outside, it seems like there is an increasing willingness to confront these issues, driven in part by the fact that fewer people are applying to programs. And that the labor of PhD students in terms of being research assistants, being TAs for undergrad classes is so necessary to making universities function at all. I would assume that there's going to be a more vibrant conversation around this in the future, and hopefully it seems like maybe it's kind of starting now. But when I was there, even the idea of leaving, I had one or two professors I was comfortable talking to about it out of maybe 9 or 10 I'd worked in some capacity with, including the folks on my PhD committee. And one of the weird things about academia is you don't really you make friends who are other graduate students, but it's hard to stay friends because you never know when someone's going to get a fellowship to move across the country, or they have to start their dissertation research, or they lose their funding and have to leave the program. It's very hard to build kind of durable personal relationships. Out of several dozen people I would have called my friends when I was in graduate school, there's really only one or two I'm still consistently close with now, because of that dynamic and the way it tends to work. Yeah, I think it's let's go. Is it meetings for stage 3 or the meeting room for stage 3? I can hang out there for another 20 minutes or so if folks have questions, but then I do need to go eat some lunch at some point. So I'll see folks there if they're curious. Thank you all for attending and listening, and thank you, Max, for moderating.